Happy May 7th, sixth graders. Hello, curious sixth graders. Wondering what you've been curious about lately. Hopefully you're wondering and having good thoughts. I hope you are all doing well and have a wonderful day. I really miss you. Today we're going to focus in on Cuba, learning a little bit about the cultures of the Caribbean. Looking at this map, you might remember Cuba from reading or listening to the book Refugee that we listened to in the fall with the family that was trying to get from Cuba to Florida. So this journey here, and they got blown a little bit off course to the Bahamas and then made it over to Miami, is where a lot of them come into to try to become refugees in the United States. So just getting to know, these islands are called the Greater Antilles, the four larger islands. So Cuba, Jamaica, and then the island of Hispaniola. So you'll see Hispaniola is the name of the island. It's divided into two countries, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and then Puerto Rico. Remember, Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. They are American citizens, but because they're a territory, not a state, they don't have a right to vote, like in our presidential elections, but they receive a lot of same benefits that U.S. citizens would. Here's a timeline of the history of Cuba. Remember in the Spanish American, they were ruled from the time of Columbus to 1898, so the very end of the 1800s, so almost 400 years for Cuba. They were ruled by Spain, and then the United States fought Spain in the Spanish-American War, and we won Cuba its independence. When it was an independent island, there was a little bit of corruption. Batista was the president, and Fidel Castro was a young military man, and he wanted a revolution. And he changed the island. He took over the government with a group in 1959, Fidel Castro. And he ruled until 2011. He then passed power to his younger brother. Fidel Castro passed away about 2013, I think. And then his younger brother has passed power to another person. So it's no longer ruled by a Castro, where it had been for years, from 1959. For almost 50 years, they did not have any change in government or change in president. And under communism, they allied themselves with the Soviet Union. They allowed the Soviet Union to put nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba that could reach many of our major cities like New York, Washington, D.C. And there is something in the 1960s, during President Kennedy's term, called the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it was 13 days where we were really close to going into World War III and nuclear weapons. Luckily, our presidents, the leader of the Soviet Union, were able to calm that down because it would have been horrible for the entire world. So Cuba has a history, and then when communism fell in 1989, the Soviet Union's economy collapsed, and many countries that the Soviets had taken over and added to Russia to become the Soviet Union became independent again. And Cuba had relied on the Soviet Union for a lot of gasoline, oil, things to run their farm machines, and they no longer could get it because the economy in Russia collapsed in the early 90s, and they could no longer send goods to Cuba. So Cuba was struggling, and they kind of allied themselves then with Venezuela, who also had some oil money, and we'll talk about Venezuela later and learn a little bit about their money and their history and their economy. But then Venezuela's gone through some rough times also. For the first time, so for years, from 1959, as soon as they became communist, U.S. citizens could not travel to Cuba. And in 2016, it was the first time that a U.S. President Barack Obama, went to Cuba and visited with the leader and trying to make negotiations to help the island, because lots of people under communism didn't have a good economy and they were not having good things. So our president was trying to help them with some food aid and sending supplies to the island. So as you read the slides carefully, remember Cuba has a command economy. That's what communism is the government commands everything. So Cuba has a command economy, Cuba has a command economy, Cuba has a command economy. You can sing that any way you want, make a nice catchy tune. There's going to be a short video that you watch, and then a news article that you're going to read, and it's just an article about Cuba as a country, giving you a little bit about that history, being part of the Greater Antilles, this chain of islands, and then how the different islands around it, how far it is from the United States, learning a little bit about the ecosystems that are on the island of Cuba, make sure you read it carefully. Cuba is a communist country. The government commands, that's why it's a command economy. And it's a dictatorship, one leader that has absolute power. So Fidel Castro, for years, for almost 50 years, ruled with absolute power, no elections, and then he passed power to his younger brother. And people are kind of waiting, thinking when the Castros weren't ruling that it would become a democracy. Well, it hasn't. They continue to pass it on to a dictator who rules with military force. They control the police, they control the military on the island, and that's how they force the people. So Cubans aren't allowed to leave the island with communism, and Americans were not allowed to visit. So that's why we have the book Refugee, where the family was trying to escape. You kind of understand that they were trying to get away from those conditions and that control. So that I think I accidentally have that twice. And then there's a map so you can see Cuba. And just really read a little bit about that Spanish history, how we helped drive the Spanish out in 1898. That was part of us becoming military might, becoming a world power. And then we continued to be very involved in the island's affairs until that communist revolution. And that was kind of revolting against the U.S. being involved because they didn't want to go from being a Spanish colony to being a U.S. territory. They wanted to be independent. And then Fidel takes over, bringing communism, which was spreading in Russia at that time after World War II. So here's another, just a text page about communism under Fidel Castro, what it was like, the government controlling all the businesses, and the land became public. So you didn't necessarily own your house or land, the government did, even though people stayed in them. And a lot of people tried to flee the island and get to the United States and send for family and try to help them to get there. And this talks about how the Soviet Union sent money and supplies, but then when the economy collapsed in the 1989 or 1990s, they weren't able to do that anymore. Conditions grew really hard. People were hungry. They didn't have food. And the U.S. has an embargo. We wouldn't help them with anything because they were allied with the Soviet Union until the 90s, until the Cold War ended. And we've talked about that Cold War is that tension between democracy and communism. Russia was communist. They were trying to spread it in Korea and Vietnam, in Asia, and then we were trying to stop and protect the democratic side. So changes come to Cuba in the 1990s, and then even more so in the 2000s. So if you can read anything current on that also, just to kind of know about that, what life was like, you'll see in the video. And then your assignment today is going to be just the check-in, just a few questions about Cuba. And its history, writing a paragraph. Make sure in your paragraphs complete sentences. Make sure you're getting the main ideas and you're using the slides to help you. So keep the slides open in a tab so that you can refer back to it when you're doing the check-in. And make sure it's the best example of your writing, capitals at the beginning of a sentence, periods at the end. We want to practice these good skills so that when you come back together in the fall, you are ready for those big 7th grade assignments. All right, I miss you guys. I hope you have a good day and have fun learning about Cuba.